When the scorching came to Appalachia, it wiped away most of the vestiges of the societies that came before. On the Ohio River's eastern shore, it cleared the way for cultists to seize their holy city. I'm the Irresolute Cartographer, and this is the story of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. We'll start this with an examination of the sites surrounding Point Pleasant in the Fallout universe and in the real world. We'll then move into the layout of the town in the Fallout universe and how it compares to the town in the real world. We'll examine the history of Point Pleasant in the Fallout universe and a brief history of Point Pleasant in the real world. We'll then close with some notes that I have on the topic. With that said, let's get started. In the Fallout universe, Point Pleasant lies on the Ohio River at the western edge of the region of Appalachia known as the Forest. North-northeast of Point Pleasant lies the heavily polluted Black Mountain Ordnance Works. The western entrance to Organ Cave can be found on the hills to the northeast of Point Pleasant. Just south of there, the Blue Ridge Caravan Company operates a bunkhouse on Route 88. Just up the hills east of Point Pleasant stands the rest area known as Marigold Pavilion. East of there, across Route 88, the Brotherhood of Steel's forward station Tango sits on a hilltop. East-southeast of Point Pleasant, a prankster has created a fake haunting at the Alpine River Cabins. Southeast of Point Pleasant, Hunter's Ridge, an old raider camp, has been taken over by Blood Eagle Raiders. Farther southeast, near the river mouth, stands the ironically named Sunshine Meadows Industrial Farm. South-southeast of Point Pleasant, Hillfolk Hot Dogs lies on the Ohio River. Let's now compare the locations of real-world sites that can be found in-game with their locations in-game. We'll start with municipalities and facilities and then cover natural sites. In-game, Flatwoods is the closest municipality, lying just over the ridge to the southeast, while the real Flatwoods can be found 80 miles east of Point Pleasant. Conversely, Charleston, at approximately 43 miles southeast, the closest municipality in the real world, lies south-southeast and farther away than Flatwoods. Hillbilly Hot Dogs, found approximately 25 miles south-southwest in the real world, is represented in-game by Hillfolk Hot Dogs to the south-southeast of Point Pleasant. The Black Mountain Ordnance Works, found north-northeast of Point Pleasant in-game, is a representation of the real-world McClintock Wildlife Management Area found 5 miles north-northeast. Organ Cave, added to in-game Appalachia this year and found just up the hill to the east, is a representation of the real-world Organ Cave. The real-world version can be found just under 121 miles southeast, just about 6 miles south of real-world Lewisburg. With the sites around Point Pleasant covered, let's consider the layout of the town itself. In-game, Point Pleasant lies on the eastern shore of the Ohio River at its junction with a drainage ditch, while real-world Point Pleasant lies at the junction of the Ohio and Kanawha rivers, on the eastern shore of the former and the northern shore of the latter. I have to assume that this drainage ditch is a stand-in for the Kanawha, as both in-game and in the real world, the road that passes over these bodies of water are carried on green ironwork bridges. As a side note, from what I've read, Kanawha River is how the locals pronounce what I've been calling the Kanawha River, so that's what I'll be going with from now on. Anyway, while there are no railroads in town, there are two in the real world, the Ohio River Subdivision and the Kanawha River Railroad. In-game, there's one highway that passes through town, West Virginia 81, which runs north to south, parallel to the river. While the roads passing through real Point Pleasant have changed over the years, today West Virginia Route 2 runs through town from southwest to east, connecting Huntington, West Virginia, home to the real-world Camden Park, to Chester, West Virginia, home to the real-world Giant Teapot. West Virginia Route 62 runs through town from the southeast to north, connecting Charleston, West Virginia to Ripley, West Virginia. In response to past flooding, and thanks to the hard work of the Army Corps of Engineers, the real-world downtown of Point Pleasant is surrounded by flood barriers both in the form of concrete walls and earthen berms. The closest replica we see to this in-game is the concrete wall at the Riverside Park. While the in-game city lies on a hillside, the real-world Point Pleasant is fairly flat. While in-game the town is fairly compact, the real-world town stretches north of its downtown about 3 miles in overall length. The town is laid out on a grid, with the roads running either parallel or perpendicular to the Ohio River. In-game, Point Pleasant is home to 7 houses, apartments over shops, and a hotel that appears to replicate a real-world building. There's a church with an attached cemetery and a survivor cemetery located next door. The post office, a theater, the Mothman Museum, and adjacent Mothman statue. The Mothman Museum and statue are facets of the real world as well, but to my knowledge, the basement shrine of the Mothman Museum is not. Point Pleasant is also home to a bank, a bus stop, a barber shop, a hunting supply store, a pharmacy, a hardware store, a feed store, an electronics store, a veterinary clinic, a liquor store, a dry cleaner, a deli, an ice cream shop, and what I assume is a restaurant called Bernardo's. With all that said, let's talk about the history of Point Pleasant in the Fallout universe. From its location, appearance, and surroundings, I think we can assume that in-game Point Pleasant shares much of the history of real-world Point Pleasant through the 20th century. If you're interested in that, I'll cover that here in a few minutes. The one thing I will note is that the Silver Bridge collapsed on December 15th, 1967, both in-game and in the real world. The biggest difference between the real world and Fallout universe regarding this event is that the bridge was rebuilt in town in-game and south of town in the real world. Regardless, by 2077, the people of Point Pleasant worked primarily in the service industry, providing goods and services to locals and tourists who came to see the Mothman Museum and adjacent statue. To most of the townsfolk, the Mothman Museum was simply a local curiosity and tourist trap. What they didn't know was that the museum was the front for a cult. In the basement, the adherents of this faith met to worship the same local cryptid honored by the museum above. First sighted November 15, 1966 near the Black Mountain Ordnance Works, the Mothman was considered by the cultists to have presaged the collapse of the Silver Bridge the following year on December 15, 1967. Beyond simple worship, the cultists would attempt to summon the Mothman, seeking his wisdom and his warnings of disasters to come. The last known instance of one of these summoning rituals within the chapel took place on Thursday, October 21st, 2077. The next day, Friday, October 22nd, 2077, the head of the cult preached that the Mothman had appeared as summoned with a portent. He had whispered to Brother Charles and warned him that the next day a terrible flood would come. This flood would arrive early in the day and wash the non-believers away. While many in the cult took this as a warning to seek shelter on the rooftops of Point Pleasant, there was a faction led away by Brother Charles to Lucky Hole Mine. The next morning at 9:46 a.m., October 23, 2077, the flood came in the form of nuclear fire. While no bomb struck Point Pleasant directly, the wind patterns typical to that area at that time of year likely would bring fallout from strikes in Ohio. While those cultists in Lucky Hole Mine would go on to become the Enlightened, we can assume that those who stayed behind in Point Pleasant either abandoned their faith or perhaps even joined the followers of the Winged One. I'll detail the cults of the Mothman in more depth in a dedicated video, but here's a quick guide as to the two groups. The followers of the Winged One worship the red-eyed Holy Mothman and will attack outsiders on sight. The Enlightened seek to commune with the violet-eyed Wise Mothman and will work with outsiders. That said, when it comes to Point Pleasant in the years after the war, there's a real dearth of information aside from two things. First, we know something about the story of Jeff Lane. Once the owner of the Mothman Museum, Jeff Lane was a cryptid enthusiast. In the aftermath of the bombs, Mr. Lane was still living in Point Pleasant, and if anything, was more interested in the mysteries of the world. Thanks to a story told by a traveler, his focus had expanded from cryptids to the interloper. We'll talk more about the interloper and the story of the moth cults, just know that the interloper appears to be some sort of Lovecraftian horror in the Fallout universe. The last thing we hear from Jeff Lane is that he's planning to search far and wide for the interloper. The other information on post-war Point Pleasant comes from the notes within the town's fledgling responders camp. For the unaware, the responders were a group of firefighters, police officers, and medical professionals that built a functional government in the aftermath of the bombs. I have a full video detailing the organization from 2077 to 2096 if you're interested. As for the exact nature of this camp and its origins, they're not easily determined. What we do know is that these responders were attempting to search for medical supplies at Arctos Pharma, AVR Medical, and Vaultec University. This is odd as all these locations had either already been searched or were far closer to other responders' outposts. We basically have two options here. Either these were early efforts by the responders when things hadn't been searched, or late ones when people were frantic for supplies. Whatever the case may be, Point Pleasant had a fairly incomplete set of barrier walls built around it and an obvious infirmary within the old church. There's evidence that the responders camped out on rooftops, likely because of the security that came with being high off the ground. In my first video on Point Pleasant, I speculated that they may have fallen to the Scorched after the battle for Morgantown Airport, but there's no evidence of that. I also speculated that they may have blown the bridge over the Ohio to prevent the Scorched from crossing the river. I'd like to think that this is the case, but we really don't have any proof of that. What we do know is that the defenders of the city died in a last stand within the church. Before the city fell, we know that at least some of the residents fled the area, heading south, first to Lewis & Sons, then to Camden Park, and onward from there. When the immigrants were gone and the responders were dead, the city fell under the control of the Scorched. When the dwellers of Vault 76 poured out into Appalachia on their reclamation day, Monday, October 23rd, 2102, they explored every inch of the land around them. At that time, Point Pleasant was still under the control of the Scorched who had conquered it from the Responders. There was little sign of the Mothman cult in town, aside from the basement chapel of the Mothman Museum, and a sacrificial altar in the Riverside Park. The exact origins of that altar on the Ohio River aren't clear, but at some point over the next 2 years it was removed. Wastelanders began to return to Appalachia by 2103, and by 2104, Point Pleasant showed some major changes. The city came under the control of the Mothman cults. The Scorched have gone from an omnipresent threat in town to serving as ornaments. Gone is the altar on the Ohio River, replaced by a brazier, one of a trio including a second at the northwestern edge of town and a third within the church. Besides this, the cultists have bedecked the town in their eldritch wooden weaves. The passages into town are watched over by the sightless red eyes of Mothman effigies. The Silver Memorial Bridge ruins are home to a new altar. Enormous fertilizer distribution blowers have been attached to local rooftops. Effigies leer over streets adorned with troughs of Radstag blood, and a throne for the Mothman has been constructed over the cryptid's eponymous museum. When I last spoke about Point Pleasant, I said, because their friends and allies were already dead, my hope is that, as isolated as Point Pleasant is, and uninvolved in the overall story, that we will see some Wastelanders settle here, and, with any luck, they'll be the people who fled Point Pleasant in the first place, and we'll be able to fill in holes in our understanding. Well, as luck would have it, one of the pre-war citizens of Point Pleasant has returned. Unfortunately, he's not in any condition to tell us anything about that time, nor the intervening years. That pre-war citizen is Brother Charles, now known as Wise Charles the Forewarned. He was the Mothman cultist who led some of the cultists away to Lucky Hole Mine. And from the sacred texts of the Enlightened, we know that he eventually led them to the Lantern, a church that they've turned into their home. Like I said, he's not capable of telling us more himself, as he seems to have been greatly affected by his encounters with a wise Mothman, who has left him looking like King Griffey Jr. overdosing on nerve tonic. He comes to Point Pleasant every Mothman equinox with 4 of his brethren: Interpreter Clarence, Observer Errol, Observer Johanna, and Observer Marlin. Point Pleasant has become the holy city for the Enlightened. Like I said previously, I'll cover the Mothman cults in greater detail in a dedicated video. For now, let's move on to a brief history of real-world Point Pleasant. I know not everyone is interested in this, so if you want to skip ahead and just hear my final notes on Point Pleasant, skip ahead to 26 minutes, 21 seconds. I've covered the geological and ancient Native American history of West Virginia in other videos, so we're going to jump right to the mid-18th century. In this time, the land that would become West Virginia was claimed by both the British and the French. The British believed their colonies extended from the east coast to deep in the interior of the continent, while the French claimed the entire Mississippi River basin, which included the watershed of the Ohio River. In 1747, the Governor General of New France, concerned about news of British traders in the Ohio Territory, ordered a military expedition to the region. This force, led by French-Canadian Marine Pierre-Joseph Céloron de Blainville, was intended to reinforce French claims in the region and reaffirm the friendly relationship between the local natives and the French. The expedition arrived at the site of modern Point Pleasant on August 18, 1749, where they buried a lead plaque asserting the territorial claim of King Louis XV to the region. Overall, the expedition was unsuccessful, as the local natives not only rejected French claims of sovereignty over their territory, but also told them they could trade with whoever they pleased, including the British. In response to this, the French sent forces into the Ohio Territory to punish the natives for their lack of fealty. News of this instability in the Ohio Territory was welcomed by the British government, who had granted land in the region to the Ohio Company. This private organization intended to send colonists into the Ohio Territory. Meanwhile, the French sent another military expedition into the Ohio Valley in 1753 to build forts to defend their claims. In October 1753, as conflict between the two powers was reaching a breaking point, Virginia Colonial Governor Robert Dinwiddie sent 21-year-old Militia Major George Washington to meet with the French forces at Fort Le Boeuf. His message when he arrived in December: remove yourself from the Ohio Territory. The French commander replied that they would not, as the French claim extended back a century before that of the English. In the spring of 1754, the French swept south and the French and Indian War began. 2 years later, the world erupted into war, and North America became but a theater of the 7 Years' War. From 1754 to 1763, the British, the French, and their respective Indian allies fought across the Ohio Territory, the Middle and Northern 13 colonies, Nova Scotia, and New France. While the war in the New World practically ended with the surrender of Montreal to the conquering British in 1760, a state of war continued until peace was settled in Europe in 1763. The French lost New France in this war, and the British now controlled all the territory from the east coast to the Mississippi River. While this might appear to open the interior of the continent to settlement, The British colonists in the 13 colonies found themselves hemmed in by the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Hoping to avoid additional conflicts between the native populations of North America and their colonists, the British set forth a boundary line that ran along the Appalachian Mountains. East of this line lay colonized and settled lands, while to the west, the Indians would remain in local control. Until such a time as the colonies were ready for an orderly and lawful expansion west, colonists were forbidden to settle west of this line. All land purchases made west of this line would be made by colonial governments, not by individuals. That said, there were those who already settled past this line with permission from the colonial governments, and they were granted exceptions. New treaties were established with the tribes, including the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768. This treaty between the British and the Iroquois pushed the lands of the Virginia colony, among others, to the Ohio River. Though they had not settled the land, the Iroquois considered the area to be their hunting grounds. In 1770, George Washington explored the new lands added to Virginia, including the site of Point Pleasant. Despite this new treaty, as British colonists began to push west, they encountered resistance from tribes other than the Iroquois, primarily the Shawnee. Though the Shawnee had representatives present at the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, they had not signed any deal and still considered this territory to be their hunting ground. In September 1773, Daniel Boone led a party of 50 settlers towards what would one day become Kentucky. Members of those non-signatory tribes captured Boone's 16-year-old son James and a small portion of the expedition just south of the Cumberland Gap on October 9th. James Boone and one other boy were tortured to death to send a message against encroaching on their lands. In response, the Boone expedition turned back, but news of the event became widespread by December 1773. Reports from the frontier in early 1774 said that the tribes on the frontier were in an uproar and the danger was growing. In May 1774, Virginia's governor, Lord Dunmore, requested that the House of Burgesses raise the regular military forces in response to the growing threat. The legislature did not comply, instead suggesting the use of militia. They failed to renew the Militia Act, and thus Lord Dunmore dissolved the House of Burgesses and raised the militia under the Invasions and Insurrection Act. This dissolution of the Virginia legislature would spawn the First Virginia Convention, but we'll leave that thread for the moment. With his forces, Lord Dunmore moved towards Ohio. He split his troops, putting 800 under control of Colonel Andrew Lewis, whom he dispatched to the site of modern Lewisburg, while he and 1,700 men moved towards Fort Pitt. The plan was for Colonel Lewis to move up the Kanawha to where it met the Ohio, while Lord Dunmore would follow the Ohio down from Fort Pitt. Once together, they would cross into Indian country to pacify the natives. Though there were a few small battles in the summer of 1774, the defining Battle of Lord Dunmore's War occurred on October 10th. Colonel Lewis and his force had arrived at the mouth of the Kanawha and were preparing to cross the Ohio when they were surprised by Shawnee and Mingo warriors under Chief Cornstalk. Though the Virginians outnumbered the Indians by a minimum of 2-1, it seems likely that Cornstalk knew that the forces of Governor Dunmore were closing in, and the odds would only worsen. The battle ran all day, but in the end, Colonel Lewis's men won. Known as the Battle of Point Pleasant, the victory forced the Indians to retreat across the Ohio River. Colonel Lewis and Lord Dunmore pursued the defeated force, erecting a temporary outpost known as Camp Charlotte. Here they crafted the Treaty of Camp Charlotte, the terms of which included the abdication of hunting rights south of the Ohio and a promise not to harass travelers on the Ohio. Chief Cornstalk agreed to sign for the Shawnee, but the Mingo refused. In response, the Virginia militia burned the Mingo village of Seekonk that sat where Columbus, Ohio sits today. With that, the expedition returned to Virginia. At the site of the Point Pleasant battlefield, they appear to have constructed a stockade known as Fort Blair, but events in early 1775 drew the militia's attention away from the frontier. Let's pick up the thread from the previous summer's First Virginia Convention. While revolutionary rhetoric had been rising throughout the colonies, on March 23, 1775, Patrick Henry gave his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech at the Second Virginia Convention. Alarmed by this speech, Lord Dunmore began clandestine work to tamp down potential armed struggle in his colony. On April 19, 1775, the battles of Lexington and Concord announced the dawn of armed revolution in the colonies. 2 days later, on April 21, 1775, before word of those battles had even reached Virginia, Lord Dunmore ordered a contingent of Royal Navy sailors to remove the Williamsburg powder magazine. This act was discovered and the militia was raised. While a crowd gathered in front of Lord Dunmore's mansion, they were pacified by the words of Patriot leaders such as Peyton Randolph, Speaker of the House of Burgesses. Lord Dunmore himself came out to explain that he had moved the powder to protect it against a rumored slave uprising. Though the crowd dispersed, tensions remained high. In May, when news finally reached Virginia of the battles in Massachusetts, militias were raised. Along with this, Patrick Henry demanded payment be made from Crown accounts for the gunpowder seized. Though this payment was made from private accounts, the governor refused to pay from crown accounts and further charged Henry as an extortionist. Late on the night of June 3, 1775, 2 men were wounded breaking into the Williamsburg powder magazine. Local outrage was such that the governor and his family were forced to flee the capital. Over the next 6 months, Lord Dunmore attempted to regain control of the colony, but following the loss of the Battle of Great Bridge on December 9, 1775, he was forced to concede that his cause was hopeless for the moment. On January 1st, 1776, he gave the order to set fire to Norfolk and quit the colony for New York. In July 1776, he returned to Britain. Though he would be appointed governor of the Bahamas after the Revolution, he never returned to Virginia. Lord Dunmore had ordered the abandoning of Fort Blair in 1775, leaving the western frontier of Virginia wide open. In May 1776, Virginia militia forces under Captain Matthew Arbuckle, a veteran of the Battle of Point Pleasant, constructed a new stockade on the site of modern Point Pleasant. Fort Randolph, as it was known, was named for the recently deceased Peyton Randolph, the same Peyton Randolph that quelled the mob assembled at the governor's mansion in April the previous year. Randolph had gone to the First and Second Continental Congress and been elected president of both before returning to Virginia, leaving John Hancock in control. He died October 22, 1775, while dining with Thomas Jefferson in Philadelphia. In October 1777, 2 Shawnee came to the fort and were taken hostage by Captain Arbuckle. A short time later, the son of Chief Cornstalk came to the fort and was taken hostage. Chief Cornstalk then returned to the site of his defeat in the Battle of Point Pleasant and was himself taken hostage. On November 10, 1777, a militiaman near the fort was killed and scalped by unknown Indians. In response, the militia murdered all 4 Shawnee. The officers, including Captain Arbuckle, tried to stop the killings but were overwhelmed. The murders alarmed the leaders of the new state and the state militia, not only because they were a stain on the honor of the newly born state of Virginia, but they believed that the murders could be a cause of war with the Shawnee. On March 27, 1778, Governor Patrick Henry placed bounties on the heads of the 5 militiamen deemed guilty. Though they were eventually brought to trial, none of their compatriots would testify against them, and so were acquitted. Initially buried at Fort Randolph, Cornstalk was reburied in the Mason County Courthouse grounds and later at Tuindaway State Park, the site of the modern memorial to the Battle of Point Pleasant. There are some locals who contend that the murder of Cornstalk led to the region being placed under a curse, and even link the Mothman to said curse. Regardless, in 1779, after having withstood an Indian attack, Fort Randolph was abandoned. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, there was increased concern about potential conflicts with the Indians, and thus the fort was rebuilt in 1785. The Northwest Indian War ran from 1786 to 1795, but seems to have never troubled the fort, and it was abandoned yet again. The frontier moved west as the United States claimed the Northwest Territory from the Northwestern Confederacy, a group composed of at least 10 tribes, including the Shawnee. A civilian settlement emerged near Fort Randolph in 1794, and on January 2, 1804, when Mason County was split from Kanawha County, Virginia, the settlement both officially became known as Point Pleasant and became the seat of the newly formed county. The town developed as a river port on the Ohio, where local farmers could sell their wares to be shipped either up or down the river. Point Pleasant was incorporated as a city in 1833. When the state was considering secession, Mason County sent James H. Couch to the Secession Convention of 1861. Though a slave owner himself, Couch voted against secession twice. During the Civil War that followed, Mason County sent over 1,000 men to the Union and 61 to the Confederacy. The war only came to Point Pleasant once, when the Confederate 6th and 8th Virginia Cavalry raided the county courthouse in March 1863, looking for munitions. On June 20th, 1863, West Virginia, having separated from Virginia, became the 35th state in the Union. In 1901, the Battle of Point Pleasant was commemorated with the founding of Point Pleasant Battlefield Monument State Park. At some indeterminate point later, the park was renamed Tuindaway State Park, Tuindaway meaning point between two waters in Wyandotte. If I had to bet, it would have been around 1973 to 1974 when Fort Randolph was reconstructed for a second time, a mile from the original site, in preparation for the bicentennial anniversary of the battle. In 1915, the Marietta Manufacturing Company moved to Point Pleasant, where they built ships until 1970. In January 1937, there were horrendous floods on the Ohio River, including in Point Pleasant. In the aftermath, the Army Corps of Engineers began construction of flood barriers along the river, including the Point Pleasant flood wall, which was completed in the early 50s. During the Second World War, a massive munitions manufacturing plant known as the West Virginia Ordnance Works operated about 5 miles north of Point Pleasant. The plant was shut down in 1946 and partially salvaged over the next 3 years before some of it became the McClintock Wildlife Management Area. Unfortunately, the site wasn't thoroughly cleaned up when it was decommissioned. In 1973, red liquid, later identified as toluene, was seen seeping from the ground near the old plant. This continued into the 1980s, leading the EPA to declare it a Superfund cleanup site, and one of the most polluted sites in America. The cleanup, started in 1983, is ongoing today. Perhaps it was some of these contaminants that contributed to the November 15, 1966 sighting of the Mothman near the old TNT site. The next year, on December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed. Originally built in 1928, the bridge served as the path of US Route 35, connecting Charleston, West Virginia, all the way to Michigan City, Indiana, on the shore of Lake Michigan. The bridge fell into the river during rush hour traffic, resulting in the deaths of 46 people and the injury of 9 others. The collapse was attributed to a 1/10 inch deep crack on a single eye-bar. When the bridge was replaced by the Silver Memorial Bridge 2 years later, the route of US 35 took over old West Virginia Route 17, and West Virginia Route 62 was extended down the old route of US 35. There were those who claimed the collapse was forewarned by the Mothman. The city's population grew from its founding up until the 1970s, when it reached a peak of 6,122, before declining every census since, reaching approximately 4,000 citizens today. Modern Point Pleasant has leaned heavily into its history, with displays celebrating Lord Dunmore's War generally, the Battle of Point Pleasant specifically, and the Mothman. When it comes to the Mothman, the town has the Mothman statue and the adjacent Mothman Museum, which has been open since 2006. That just about covers the real-world history, but I have some notes before closing things out. First, as mentioned in the description and in the section about the responders, this is a remake of my third Civic-based lore video. The first version was released September 21st, 2019. It was made in my original style, detailing information chronologically rather than the current style of Fallout Universe first, Real World second. I also have a better microphone now, and am better with it too. All the original footage and script were lost with a failure of an external hard drive, so the footage I needed from that original video, which we'll see in a moment, comes from downloading from YouTube. Second, the stories of the Mothman were popularized in the 1975 book, The Mothman Prophecies, which served as the inspiration for the 2002 movie of the same name. Third, there used to be a Christmas tree in the Ohio River beneath the Silver Bridge. I believe that this was related to the fact that the bridge collapsed on December 15th, and in the Mothman Prophecies, there were Christmas presents floating in the water. This tree has been removed from the game. Fourth, the Jeep in town probably isn't a reference, but it could be. Carl Probst, born in Point Pleasant in 1883, was the designer of the Jeep in 1940. Fifth, Jeff Lane may have just been an employee of the Mothman Museum and not the owner. We don't see anywhere that he was explicitly the owner, but that's the direction in which I lean. The fact that he has keys to the museum and sent Rich Wilson a Mothman Museum poster isn't in any way definitive, as is the fact that he didn't live immediately over the museum. The fact that the real-world owner of the Mothman Museum is named Jeff, specifically Jeff Wamsley, seems like a fairly good clue. Again, nothing 100% definitive, but these things point that way. Sixth, there appears to be a reference to the 1988 film Beetlejuice on the wall of the church next to the graveyard. It appears to be a door drawn with chalk, similar to the one drawn by Adam and Barbara Maitland that they used to get to the other world. Lastly, we have Note from Miller. Note from Miller is a tribute to Evan Miller, a Fallout fan who passed away on June 8th, 2018, 5 months prior to the release of Fallout 76. I think this is a great little memorial. Alright, I think that'll do it for the story of what happened to Point Pleasant. Follow me on X for lore video announcements at Gaming with Maps. My Discord is open to the public, there's a link in the channel's banner. I stream every Friday evening on YouTube, come check it out if you're interested. If you appreciate what I do here and you want to support the channel financially, you can become a member on YouTube or a patron with Patreon. I want to thank my channel members and patrons, Mesothelioma, 76 of Texas, Dark Malcontent, Real76, Dr. Orion, Samsung Smart Fridge, Night Spearhead, Ahotep, Despy, Electric Head, Hero Cunning, Laced Cake, E, and NB Mole Miner for their support. I also want to specifically thank Dark Malcontent for helping with this video script. This has been the Irresolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.